Good afternoon. My name is Kim Pimley, and as chair of the International Relations Commission, it's my great honor to welcome you to this afternoon's session, A Middle East Come Undone, Slaughter in Syria, Iran Emboldened. The key to peace and stability in the Middle East lies not in finding a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in addressing the war zone beyond Israel's borders. For years, Syrian President Assad has made war on his own people. More than 400,000 Syrians have been killed, and many more injured or forced out of their homes, with no end in sight. ISIS terrorizes millions in Iraq and spreads its hateful ideology far beyond the Middle East. And in Tehran, the clerical regime reviles the United States and calls for the destruction of Israel. It violates human rights of its own people and uses proxies to spread terrorism beyond its borders. We have with us today renowned experts to address the complex web of Middle Eastern state and non-state entities. Joining us today are Robert Ford, who served for 30 years in the State Department, most recently as the U.S. Ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014. Ambassador Ford received a presidential honor in 2012 for his leadership of the American Embassy in Damascus. Dr. Gilles Kepel, described by the New York Times as France's most famous scholar of Islam, is author of the just published, widely praised book, Terror in France, The Rise of Jihad in the West. A recent headline in the Daily Beast referred to him as Emmanuel Macron's man on terrorism. William McCants is Director of U.S. Relations with the Islamic World for the Brookings Institution and a sought-after expert on Islamic politics and terrorism. He has been an advisor for the State and Defense Departments, and in 2015 published his latest book, The ISIS Apocalypse. And Juan Zarate is Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and was Deputy National Advisor for Combating Terrorism under George W. Bush, where he was responsible for developing and implementing U.S. counterterrorism strategy. Our moderator, Ambassador Wendy Chamberlin, is president of the Middle East Institute. She served in the U.S. Foreign Service for 29 years, was Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees at the UN, and was U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan during and immediately after 9/11. Please join me in welcoming our very distinguished panel.
Well, thank you very much, Kim Pimley, for that introduction. And my congratulations to the JWC for their Global Forum, and really for all the work that you do all year long. This is an organization that I deeply admire from my position now as president of the Middle East Institute. And before I begin, I'd like to just to acknowledge another person here who I have long admired and respected for her work in the U.S. Congress for so many years, Congressman Nita Lowey. Thank you very much. As Kim pointed out, the topic that we're addressing on this panel today really gets at the heart of the crisis in the Middle East. Middle East come undone, slaughter in Syria, Iran emboldened. You know, this is a particularly informed audience, and if you chose the fact that you chose this panel indicates to me that you, like me, are pretty outraged by the slaughter in Syria. And the fact that what Assad is doing to his people has opened the door for Iranian expansion and for the spread of extremism throughout the world. The statistics are staggering. Over 500,000 people have been killed. 5 million people have fled their country, left their borders in fear of their lives. Another 6.6 have left their homes inside Syria for fear of their lives. And 14 million people are in desperate need for humanitarian assistance. One of the more controversial issues that have been debated in the United States since the Civil War began in 2013 is, why does Syria matter to us? Why does Syria matter to the United States? And many people, including myself, think that it does matter because people matter, and that thoughtful, targeted, timely intervention by the United States in the very early part of the crisis would have done a great deal to have averted some of the horrible carnage that we've seen. The instinct of the Obama administration was to avoid American involvement in yet another Middle East war. And I don't want to be too simplistic about the Trump policy because sometimes that's hard to ferret out, but it does seem as if he's deferred the future of Syria with an Assad, continuation of Assad, to Iranian, Russian, and Turkish policymakers, and that he's focusing almost exclusively on, what is he called, the extermination, or is it the annihilation of ISIS? I think this raises many questions. There's a strong case for that the disintegration of Syria into a failed state is very detrimental to the United States and very significant to us. I mean, first, the refugee deluge into Europe has undermined one of our most important allies, the EU. Some say it's even been a cause for Brexit. Secondly, the dispute with Turkey has hit a big fissure in another one of the more important foreign policy allies that we have, and that is NATO. Third, the UN UN humanitarian agencies, where I once worked, is struggling. Their capacity to respond to the humanitarian crisis has frankly outstripped their ability and certainly their finances. And then finally, allies, important allies to us, Israel, now faces an emboldened Iran and a much strengthened Hezbollah right on the borders. You know, this is not good. Syria is important. So how we respond as a nation and how we will respond in the future will really determine what American leadership will be in the world in the future. And, you know, we've always taken that for granted, America's leader, but not anymore. So these are really pretty extraordinarily complex issues, and we've got the right panel, as Kim pointed out and introduced them to talk about it today. So I hope that all of us can walk out of this room much more enlightened. Let's find the answers. Let's find the solutions. Let's begin with you, Will. You're an expert on ISIS. You know, it baffles me a bit how an organization that can be so vicious and yet so successful in recruiting people from all over the world to give their lives for what? So can you walk us through this? Tell us a little bit about the history and the ideology of ISIS.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me today. ISIS's history, how's it now? Better. ISIS's history formally goes back to Iraq in 2006, but it has an earlier predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that was born in 2004, 2005. It is an organization that emerged in the debris left after the invasion of Iraq. It is really a consequence of the invasion and the ensuing civil war. And some of its more capable early personnel were former members of Saddam's military and intelligence apparatus, and they have since risen through the organization's ranks. So it owes a lot to our invasion of that country in 2003. It is an organization that thrives on chaos and thrives on political vacuums. Those vacuums and that chaos was closed off to the group by 2008, 2009, by the U.S. military working together with its tribal allies, Sunni tribal allies, in Iraq, and capably kept the Islamic State, as it was known at the time, underground. That doesn't mean it disappeared. It still continued to be one of the world's most powerful terror organizations, but they were unable to function as an insurgency. That changed with the Syrian civil war and then with the outbreak of conflict in Iraq soon to follow. Again, you had a period of chaos and turmoil that the group capably exploited. It is unusual for an organization like the Islamic State, a jihadist organization, to, number one, focus on establishing a state in the near term. For point of comparison, its parent organization, Al-Qaeda, thought that the states should be established in the long term once the jihadists have built up more of a popular base among Muslims. The Islamic State sees it exactly the converse. You establish a state first, and then you go from strength to strength. So it differs from jihadists in that way. It also differs, at least from Al-Qaeda, in its political theology. Both groups hate the infidel, it goes without saying. But in the Muslim world, they are much more sophisticated in their thinking and who they define as the enemy. Al-Qaeda wants to, as I said, establish a broad front of Sunni Muslims in order to establish Islamic states. The Islamic State does not believe you need a broad political front to succeed. They define true believer very narrowly, far more narrowly than Al-Qaeda, and they proceed on that basis. That is why they are willing to do things on camera that Al-Qaeda, at least official Al-Qaeda, hiding out in Pakistan and Afghanistan, would not countenance and criticize them for. One of the most famous ones being the early beheading videos by the Islamic State's predecessor, Zarqawi, which he was chastised for by Al-Qaeda. But he believed, and the organization that he helped to found continues to believe, that this kind of grotesque violence serves multiple purposes. It intimidates their enemies, it cows people who may stand against them, and it is an important recruiting tool. You ask who would be excited by these kind of things. There's a small number of people in the world who get off on this kind of extreme violence. And they wanted to travel to join the Islamic State in order to do it under an organization that controlled a vast amount of territory and would let them get away with it. The third thing that distinguishes the organization, I'll stop here, are its apocalyptic views. It is unusual for a Sunni jihadist organization to talk about the end times. They pay lip service to it, but it's supposed to happen far in the future. The Islamic State made it one of the centerpieces of their recruitment pitch, particularly with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. Most of the Islamic prophecies of the end times have to do with Syria and Iraq. So it lends itself to this kind of framework, and they used it with great success to attract a number of foreign fighters to their cause. Some estimate upwards of 40,000. And this was in part due to the idea that the end of times had come and that they were there to rebuild God's kingdom on earth.
Well, I'm still a little perplexed because, as you say, the beheadings and some of the atrocities attract sadists from all around the world. You can't build a state, you can't build a country, you can't build something durable on hate. What comes next? When we've moved into Mosul, we've routed them from Mosul, we're about to rout them from Raqqa, where do they go? What comes next? Will they have a state?
I don't think they will have a state. I believe from the beginning when they declared their so-called caliphate that they would lose it because they would antagonize powerful foreign nations that would bring about their destruction. So they won't keep their government, but they will continue to, in the first instance, function as an insurgent organization for several years to come. And second of all, even if they are driven underground, they will remain a powerful terrorist group. This is an organization that thrives on the political dysfunction of Iraq and now Syria. And before, when they were driven underground in 2009, they set about creating the conditions for their comeback. They assassinated something on the level of 2,000 members of these Sunni tribal awakenings that had stood against them. They set up a capable extortion racket, particularly run out of the city of Mosul, raising money in mafia style. And they continued to carry out a series of brilliant and deadly terror attacks inside of Iraq to continue to gain momentum and attract recruits. They're going to do the same in the years to come. This is a powerful group. Bear in mind, they have lost something on the level of 60,000 fighters. That's more than we sustained during the Vietnam War. This is a very strong organization. It still controls half of its territory. It's not even been defeated as a government yet. It is going to be with us for years to come.
Robert, ISIS isn't the only horrible terrorist group within Syria. Will has given us some points on the differences between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda in Syria has taken a very different tact. Can you talk to us a little bit about the differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, and why they're more popular with the local people?
Yeah. So I think, can people hear me? Yeah. Good. So, well, first, I'd like to thank AJC for the invitation to speak to you today. I'm kind of amazed that so many people would listen to stuff about Islamic State and Al-Qaeda over lunch. You people need help. I'm beyond help. So, and I'm honored to be on a panel with people like Will and Juan and Gilles Kepel and Wendy. So thank you very much for the invitation. Al-Qaeda in Syria has scared me since 2011. We understood it was coming in from Iraq into Syria in 2011. During that summer, we had information. I was at the embassy at the time. And they have gained strength steadily. Couple of things to understand about Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's not the Islamic State. They fight each other regularly. Number two, they both come from the same mother organization, the Islamic State of Iraq, that fought our soldiers in Iraq. And I was in Iraq for 5 years during that wretched war. But while the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, is basically using much of the same game plan from a gentleman, terrorist I should say, whom Will mentioned to you, a guy named Zarqawi, the Al-Qaeda evil twin in Syria has changed its playbook, and it has done very well doing that. If you will, it's a kind of an Al-Qaeda version 3.0. What does that look like? Whereas ISIS refuses to make alliances with other groups and says all groups must operate under its sole authority, Al-Qaeda in Syria has always reached out and made tactical alliances with other Syrian fighting groups. That's a very different kind of Islamic extremist from what we had, say, during the Iraq War when the American soldiers were there, and is very different from ISIS now in Syria. Al-Qaeda in Syria is actually the leader of a coalition of groups fighting Bashar al-Assad. There are other groups outside that coalition that are also fighting Bashar al-Assad. Not all Syrian fighting groups against Assad are under Al-Qaeda, but many of them are. That's number one. Number two, whereas in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq fighting against our soldiers was blowing up infrastructure and making life miserable. No electricity, no running water, shooting at airplanes coming into Baghdad airport trying to land. This is 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9. In Syria, Al-Qaeda actually has an entire organization rebuilding infrastructure. They focus in particular in northwestern Syria, in the Syrian province of Idlib. They're rebuilding water systems. They're helping local councils rebuild everything from electric networks to bakeries. That is not something Zarqawi ever would have done in Iraq. The Islamic State, I think, has done some things like that in Syria, but Al-Qaeda in Syria was doing it first. They do it with locals. They don't have so many foreign fighters in the al-Qaeda Syria branch. They're mostly Syrians, which again helps them integrate into the local communities. And that's the third point, is they really embed in the local communities. I just mentioned they work with local councils. There are no local councils in the areas where the Islamic State governs in Syria, where it's fighting our forces, Kurdish forces, others. The al-Qaeda in Syria actually accepts and works with local councils. Do they straight arm them sometimes? Absolutely they do. You might think of them as sort of a, I don't know, a mafia type group that will extort and will pressure. They're not pleasant, but they're not beheading a lot of people. And most of their suicide car bombs are not directed against civilian targets. They're directed against Bashar al-Assad's army. And Syrians notice that. So that I used to have these really kind of shocking conversations with Syrians saying, you've got to watch out for these guys, they're terrorists. And they'd say, no, but they're helping us fight Bashar al-Assad. They're not as bad as you say. And I would have to remind them where, from whence they came in Iraq, what was their background. They are, I don't want to be misunderstood, but the beginning way to think about them is they are a kinder, gentler, and therefore even more dangerous al-Qaeda. That's what version 3.0 is. Anti-Western? Absolutely. Have they killed Americans? Probably. But they don't have the same public image in Syria that the Islamic State does of ruthless brutality. It's much more targeted, and in many cases it's restrained.
Robert, a follow-up question. The third option, the third forces fighting in Syria against Assad were for want of a better word, the moderate groups, which
Free Syrian Army.
Free Syrian Army, which the United States and other Gulf Arabs supported a bit, not very much. But I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Free Syrian Army has not received any support from the United States since last November, and that it's atrophying. Could you talk about the strength of the Free Syrian Army as an alternative that is fighting Assad? Because if we're not supporting the Free Syrian Army anymore, and we are going after al-Qaeda targets who are fighting Assad, where are the people? And what will the people think about U.S. policy?
The Free Syrian Army is in no way, shape, or form anything more than a moniker. It's a name. It doesn't have a central command. There was an attempt to set one up. It failed badly, mainly because of foreign states supporting it, undermined it. It's just if you will, it's a title. And it's actually made up of a lot of different groups, some Islamist, some quite secular, but who are united in the desire to push the government of Bashar al-Assad out. Most of them support a negotiated deal, but they're pretty firm that there has to be systemic, deep structural change in Syria. Their support dating back to 2012 was always problematic. Turkey helped them more than any other country. The Saudis helped some groups. The Qataris helped some groups. The Americans helped some groups. But the logistics support was always really ragged and unreliable. One of the interesting things I mentioned that al-Qaeda in Syria is kind of it's learned a lot of lessons from its bitter experience in Iraq. One of the things that al-Qaeda in Syria has done is it has taken over the border crossings of the different supply routes that come down from Turkey that send in humanitarian aid and sometimes send military equipment. And because they control those border points, even if the equipment is not officially destined for them, they usually take a certain tax, is what they call it, which interferes, of course, with the humanitarian assistance, and it also interferes with the ability of Free Syrian Army units who are fighting Bashar al-Assad to get supplies, because they are dependent on the goodwill of the al-Qaeda affiliate to let those supplies through. So they are weakening. They're much weaker now relative to the extremists than they were in 2013 and 2014. Frankly, we didn't help them much, and we ended up with a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where the moderates are weaker.
Yeah. Juan,
Yes, Wendy.
turning back to ISIS, but looking a little broader, ISIS seems to have metastasized throughout the world. It's established itself in southern Philippines, in Yemen, and Libya. Can you talk a little bit about the spread of ISIS throughout the world and what this means?
Absolutely. And Wendy, let me thank you for moderating this panel. It's an honor for me to be here. Thank the AJC for the invitation. Really a pleasure. I could just listen to these people all day long. So maybe I've got a problem.
You need help too.
Yeah, I do. That's a given. That's a given. Yeah, I think part of the challenge with the Islamic State is less about their defeat on the battlefield, because Will is right. I think they will lose their territory. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be a slog. I think all of the timetables that have been given to retake Mosul and Raqqa, their capital in Syria, have always been off because it's much more difficult than people have imagined. But I think the real danger with the Islamic State is that they have presented a vision for the global jihadi movement that allowed not only for the metastasizing that we're witnessing, but for the wild imaginings of this movement to actually think about what comes next. Some of that has forced a bit of the al-Qaeda adaptations that Ambassador Ford was talking about, but some of this has led to an establishment of the Islamic State brand, at least, or the flag flying over various militancies and insurgency groups around the world. And I think one of the great dangers is that in fast-forwarding this idea of a caliphate, they were really attempting not only to establish governance as a proto-state and erasing borders and recruiting foreign fighters, but in some ways they were sending a message to the global jihadi world that we don't have to wait for a millennium for this state to emerge. This can be a reality now. And I've been a critic for a long time saying the fact that we have allowed this group to have at least the physical space and the ability to advertise this idea has really been a huge disadvantage, because what it's done is it's allowed not only them to innovate their operations, to innovate their social media campaigns, innovate how they think about financing, develop governance models for terrorist groups, but they've also then been able to link to these other elements of the jihadi network around the world. And so that has included things like Boko Haram in Nigeria and West Africa, which had long been an al-Qaeda affiliate, now flies the banner of the Islamic State. Some would say, look, it really doesn't matter if it's al-Qaeda or ISIS when you talk about that, but the reality is the Islamic State has purchase and has brought some capabilities, some financing to the constellation of these groups. They have taken territory in Mindanao. The Philippine government is having a real hard time dislodging a relatively small group of fighters in a city in Mindanao who have proclaimed their allegiance to ISIS. It's an offshoot of some of the other jihadi groups that have been there. And they've laid claim to territory. And of course, we've seen ISIS emerge in places like Yemen, in Libya. We've also, of course, seen their foreign fighters and the diaspora scatter to places like Europe. And so really the legacy of the Islamic State is less about their physical footprint in Iraq and Syria, though that is incredibly damaging, I think, and the recovery is going to be enormously difficult. It's more about giving life to this broader global jihadi movement, which has now ensconced itself around the world. Southeast Asia is a really interesting question, though, Wendy, because in many respects, you look at the post-9/11 environment, you say, look, where have we had success around the world? Most of us would say Southeast Asia, whereas post-9/11, most counterterrorism experts would say, look, that's the next front in terms of a war on al-Qaeda. They had well-established cells. They had the Hambali network. They were trying to develop an anthrax capability out of Southeast Asia. They had pasantras and madrasas that were fueling this. And for the most part, though it continued to persist, that threat was contained. There were attacks in Bali and elsewhere, but really it was contained. And a lot of that had to do with what the Singaporeans, the Indonesians, and the Australians, with our help, were doing. What you see now, though, is a resurrection of these networks. And I think that's really the danger of the Islamic State, the fact that they've breathed new life into these groups and frankly created new adherents. And you would ask the question, who's drawn to this? And it's not just the 6, 17, 18-year-old who likes watching beheading videos. At the early stages of the Syrian conflict, we were seeing and hearing news of small groups of professionals, doctors, engineers, lawyers, who were collecting their services, their work, and actually traveling to what they saw as the legitimate form of Islam and the place to not only express themselves and their identity, but to contribute to the cause of an Islamic caliphate. And so you had groups coming from Malaysia, Indonesia, and around the world, and we sent up flares from the outside saying this is a warning sign that this is a group that is beginning to galvanize a global movement, which is dangerous. It was dangerous when al-Qaeda was trying to lead it. It was even more so now with the Islamic State, and we needed to do more to disrupt it. So to answer your question, it's not good news because we can do quite a bit to deal with the physical safe haven, and as Will said, there's going to be a residual insurgency that follows. What I worry about is the spokes on the bicycle wheel, where this group has implanted itself either ideologically or even with operatives and capabilities in other parts of the world. That's a real danger.
Well, it is. It's frightening. Dr. Kepel, you've done a lot of work in this area, particularly with the banlieue in France, where ISIS has found many recruits. Can you shed some light onto what the attraction is within French? Now, most of the French radicalized extremists come from northern Africa, from Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya. What is peculiar about the terrorists that you are seeing now in France? And frankly, I don't want to eliminate just concentrate just on France. You can give a broader answer because I know your research extends really globally.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for inviting me today. Before focusing on France, I would like to come back a little to what we said before, because after all, I was trained as an Arabist in Syria, and I know the place a little. I also was invited in Israel, a country some of you are interested in, I imagine, in June last year, and the Israeli Mossad took me to the border with Syria, on the of the Golan. And it was something quite fascinating, because, for the conversation we have of, what are the fault lines today and how does it function? Is Israel still at the center of attention? Or, do we have a sort of much more complex phenomenon? Look what happened only today with the Qatar, Saudi, whatever, and Trump. For 40 years, the Israeli-Syrian border was not moving. There were rusting Syrian tanks on the one hand, and the Israelis were there with their weaponry and so on and so forth. Now, they have three neighbors. It's a 40-kilometer, whatever, 30 miles, I don't know how, I'm not good with miles, 40-something kilometers border. On the north, which is not big, you have Hezbollah and the Syrian army. In the center, you have al-Qaeda, which has then metastasized into Jabhat al-Nusra and now Fatih al-Sham, whatever it's called. And on the south, you have ISIS. So you have there, on this little 40 kilometers border, you have the different conflicting actors in the region on the one hand, and you have Israel on the other hand. So, for some strange reason, both the two brands of jihadists, both ISIS on the south and al-Qaeda, cling as much as possible to the Israeli border, because whenever the Bashar al-Assad regime wants to send a plane to bomb them, the plane is downed by the Israeli air defense. So this is what you may call the jihadi Zionist alliance or whatever of sorts, if you like. And then one very interesting thing also is that, just to follow up on what the ambassador said, you know, they have internecine fightings, mainly ISIS against Al-Qaeda. And when Al-Qaeda's fighters are wounded, the Israelis open the border and treat them in Israel. What is the kind of conversation they had? I asked, but you know, being a frog and a goy, I was not trusted. Maybe for some reason, I don't know. But I sort of had my own ideas. And there you have, in a way, you know, it's a sort of, in a nutshell, or it's a sort of a metonymy of what is happening in the region, with this sort of new alliance, or at least the building of relations between Israel and the petromonarchies, because, you know, Al-Qaeda is funded by petrodollars. Where they come from, we'll find, but it's petro anyway. And so we have a sort of realignment of the fault lines in the region. You know, it's not necessarily anymore Israel against the Arabs, but it's Israel. And then within the region, Sunnis and Shias, Sunnis against Sunnis, and this creates a very new landscape, as opposed to what we were used when, you know, except for Will, who's still a young man. The other here are so close to retirement, and so when we were before, no, it's big for you. When you know, this is not at all the Middle East or the Levant that we're used to. Now, to address your question, most French and European foreign fighters went to the Levant, not to Syria as such, but to this Levant area, which in Arabic is called Sham, something which means what's on the left when you look towards Mecca. And the Bilad al-Sham, the country of the Levant, the area of the Levant, which includes Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and some part of Iraq in the sort of doctrinal geography of Islam, is a very important place for messianic and apocalyptic reasons, as Will just mentioned, because pious Muslims believe that the Antichrist or the Dajjal will come to Damascus, close to the end of the world. Then Jesus will come down the minaret, the white minaret of the Umayyads mosque. He will lead the Muslim prayer, become a Muslim, hence defeat the Antichrist, and then the world will be open to Islam forever. So this was a very interesting thing that, you know, this kind of belief mixed with this sort of messianic or apocalyptic belief, if you wish, mixed with a sort of humanitarian language, because many would go originally, and they were backed both by, at least, or let go by the French government under Hollande, who did not understand those issues very well. But the same happened with Libya also. You know, when Manchester, what happened in Manchester, and I'm just back from London, was largely due to the fact that those 10,000 Libyans in Manchester who were given refugee status by the Brits in the good old days of what we French call Londonistan, which is in the late 1990s, they welcomed all Islamists from the whole world because they anticipated that Islamists would rule the Muslim world. So they just sort of wanted to talk to them in advance. So they went back to Libya also to oust Colonel Gaddafi. Many in Britain believed that they would join things that would be like what you call a moniker, i.e. the Free Syrian Army or the Free Libyan Army. And there were people, but they didn't. They would go with the hardened jihadists, and then would not necessarily stay there, come back to Britain. And, you know, the Manchester sort of conundrum is part of that, together with local gang culture and what have you. So there, what we have is a sort of a strange attraction of some of the young people, whether they be from North Africa, converts to Islam from Turkey, originally from Turkey or South Asia, for this sort of sham, this ISIS battlefield. A final note on that. As far as we're concerned, in France, we had 239 people who were killed between January 2015 with the Charlie Hebdo and hyper-kosher supermarket attack, and then until the stabbing of Catholic priest Jacques Hamel in his church in Normandy on the 26th of July 2016. There were many threats, and yours truly has been sentenced to death 3 times already, so except in America, which is a safe country, I live 24/7 under police protection. And what was very striking was that after July, they were unable to implement any more attacks on French soil. For 9 months, we've been immune. Not that they did not try. On the contrary, they tried. But all attacks were foiled for many reasons, one of them being what you mentioned, i.e. the military pressure on ISIS or pseudo-caliphate territory. Because they're bombed, they are drowned. The guy who sentenced me to death is already in paradise or in hell because Trump droned from him, so I'm maybe the only pro-Trump Frenchman, because he settled my own accounts. No, it's true. Yeah, that's maybe a singleton, but that's why. On those matters only, not talking about climates. Okay. And then the Turks sealed the border, which is a very important issue because we did not expect that. Where everybody was very worried that as the caliphate territory was under duress, people would flee and cross the border back into France, Britain, Germany, and the like, and they would have been trained, brainwashed, be terrible. The Turks, because it's a bargaining chip for them, are sealing the border. No one goes out for the time being. Now, why was it that it stopped in France, and then that we now see Britain and Germany and Britain more and more attacked? Probably because the French police establishment, which is very centralized and therefore more efficient than decentralized comparable systems when facing that kind of threats, has been able to arrest preemptively most of them. And also because of the duress, because coordination was made more difficult, coordination of attacks like my guy who was killed and others, whereas Britain and Germany had police establishments that were less prepared to that. They sort of relied, particularly in Britain, far more on brokers to whom they had farmed out social peace in their banlieues or inner cities or what have you, which now is turning to a large extent against themselves because those brokers do not really deliver. And the Libyan issue, the Manchester issue is a very interesting case in point for that. So as of now, where are we heading? Our election was not taken hostage of jihadism, which was something very important because many pundits had prophesied that Marine Le Pen would make a landslide because, people would be sick and tired of jihadist attacks. And this is the jihadist ideology that, that Abu Musab al-Suri, whom Will knows well, I mean, intellectually at least, the idea of the third generation jihadism, who said that Europe was the soft underbelly of the West, that you had to have a sort of bottom-up jihad based on networks, not this pyramidal, top-down, centralized Al-Qaeda attacks that was mentioned earlier on. This, to some extent, has reached its limitations because they send a lot of people who go under the radar of the police establishment, but who are less well trained than the 9/11 perpetrators, right? Therefore, that's a downside for them. That is to say that they reach out at easy targets, like killing people on the street, sending a truck in the crowd. But terrorism is not only about killing people. It has a political economy of its own. It's about mobilizing the masses on their behalf, right? And it's difficult to identify with someone who kills an 8-year-old girl in Manchester or anyone at random. You know, only the hardened or the core group will applaud and say, great. But for, you know, the wider Muslim population that they are trying to target in Europe, I think that they are not on a winning thing. And one last thing, when we monitor a lot those the chat rooms, and at least in French and some other languages also, but are the Islamists and also the wills after they're killed, and they are not upbeat at all. They, you know, a year ago they said, hey, we're going to sell your women and children in the slave markets of the Islamic State in London and Paris and so on. So I don't know whether you've seen none of that anymore. It's sort of, we're doomed, the caliphate is going to fall, and we have to find another way. We're looking for another strategy. So it's a sort of, you know, it's a complex phenomenon, and I think we should not believe that we're through it. Yes, I fully agree with what was said before, but nevertheless we have made significant progress in the understanding of their dynamics, provided we take the ideology seriously.
Yeah, well, thank you. Robert, let me turn to you and pick up on something that Gilles said.
It's Gilles, by the way.
Gilles, sorry. That we have a common enemy with Israel and against ISIS, with the Gulf Arabs. But they also have another common enemy, and that is Iran. So I'd like to turn a little bit to Iran before we open it up to the broader audience. You know, General Mattis and General McMaster, who are now in the government, really have a deep personal resentment towards Iran. They were commanding generals in Iraq. They lost friends. They lost soldiers to what they believe was Iranian interference at a time when you were in Iraq. And now it's very clear that Iran has established a stranglehold on it. Some people don't even think Assad runs his country. They think that it's so totally permeated by Iran at all levels of their ministries in the army. So Iran has clearly been successful in establishing what it had wanted to, and that is a land bridge from Iran to the Mediterranean. Yet Iran is fighting ISIS. So where do we stand in this contradiction? Trump was just out in Riyadh saying that he would act aggressively against Iran, but he doesn't seem to be acting aggressively against Iran in Syria. Hard question.
No, it's okay. I'm trying to think how to say this in a simple way. Iran hates ISIS and it hates Al-Qaeda, but Iran's main effort is not against them. Iran's main effort in Syria is to preserve the government of Bashar al-Assad, and if that means that they must fight groups like the Free Syrian Army instead of ISIS, that's okay. Sometimes they don't have many forces in Syria directly. They mostly have militias that they've mobilized from places like Iraq and Lebanon and even Afghan refugees. Those militias that the Iranians command, their number one target has always been the Free Syrian Army, not Al-Qaeda and not the Islamic State, because those more moderate Syrian opposition forces are the real threat to Bashar al-Assad's political stranglehold on the Syrian scene. Is it possible, therefore, and I think the Obama administration wondered about this, and maybe the Trump administration is too, I'm not sure, is it possible to sort of have a tactical alliance with Iran against the Islamic State, against Al-Qaeda? Maybe, but it would require that the Iranians change their focus. And their focus, as I say, is not on the Islamic State, and it's not on Al-Qaeda. There's another angle about this. Will and I were talking about this a little bit at lunch today. The Iranian presence in Syria helps drag out the war. Frankly, it would be easier to get to a political negotiation if Iran was not helping the Bashar al-Assad government so strongly. Iran's influence in Syria now is stronger than Russia's. Let me say that again. Iran's influence in Syria is stronger than Russia's. Here's another thing. Russia cannot make Assad give big concessions. Russia can't. For a long time, God bless him, John Kerry was hoping that the Iranians would deliver Bashar al-Assad to a political deal. The Russians could not do it. They don't have that much influence. Iran might, but Russia definitely doesn't. So as this war drags on, and especially as it moves into eastern Syria as well as in the west, Syrian Sunni Arabs, like Iraqi Sunni Arabs, will look more and more at this growing Iranian presence in eastern Syria, and it will probably aggravate the extremist recruitment problem that we already have in Syria. That is to say, the presence of Iranian forces and Iranian allied forces in eastern Syria will help the Islamic State and help al-Qaeda recruit for the insurgency that is to come after the fall of Raqqa, and on the Iraq side of the border after the fall of Mosul. So that the Iranian presence is pernicious both against Israel and the strengthening Iranian influence in Damascus and the role of Hezbollah. And then it's also pernicious in the eastern part of the country where our forces are. How many of you know that American military aircraft launched a direct strike against Iranian-backed militias in Syria 2 weeks ago for the first time ever? How many of you knew that? Okay, watch that space. Bit by bit, we are adding forces. The Americans just sent more forces into eastern Syria. The Iranians are adding forces. There is a growing possibility of a direct confrontation between our forces and our Syrian allies on the ground, and the Iranian forces and their allies on the ground in eastern Syria. And this is a growing issue.
So what you're saying is that the secret plan that candidate Trump talked about, and then when he asked Secretary Mattis to come up with a plan within 30 days, but there was never an announcement, there's never a rollout for a plan, that in fact we're seeing that on the ground now, and it looks like increased deployments and increased activity of the American military.
My sense is that the Trump administration is trying to gauge how to block expansion of Iranian influence in western Iraq and in eastern Syria, because the Iranian goal, it is becoming clearer and clearer, is to have a land bridge. They've never had that. This would be new. A land bridge between Iran and Lebanon. Why Lebanon? Hezbollah. Why Hezbollah? Israel. They've always had to resupply Hezbollah by air to Damascus airport. If they have a land bridge, they probably will still do a lot of air supply to Damascus airport. But they will have other options if they have this land route, which they and their allies control, all the way from the Iranian border through Iraq, through Syria, and over to Lebanon.
Okay, one last quick question that I want to direct to Juan before opening it up. Juan, you really made a name for yourself at the Department of Treasury before you even went to the White House for monitoring and tracking terrorist financing and shutting it down. That's easier to do when it's a state. And you're very effective. Those policies were very effective in shutting down financing for the Islamic State. These homegrown terrorists don't require much financing. And that looks like, and Dr. Kepel certainly made some very good points about that, one of the major threats now to both Europe and the United States. Maybe the toughest question of the panel: how do you stop these homegrown terrorists?
Yeah. Incredibly difficult, and we're seeing this in Europe play out. It's part of the problem with the homegrown terrorists or the small cells and actors in places like Western Europe is just the volume question. You look at what the British are having to deal with. They're dealing with 3,000 open cases. They've disrupted 18 significant plots since 2013, 5 just since the Westminster attack. Having to prioritize around different cells and individuals is incredibly difficult. And so you're right, Wendy, you try to apply whatever tools you have available, not only to understand what those networks look like and to prioritize which of those are most worthy of attention and disruption. But then you try to figure out what tools do you have to bring to bear. And part of the reason we focus so much attention on undercutting the financing was to say, look, it's very difficult to stop each and every attack, and you're not going to stop every dollar or euro or pound that goes to a terrorist actor who wants to blow themselves up. But if you're able to constrict the budget of these groups, especially the organized groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, you at least constrict what their strategic goals ultimately look like. If you force the Al-Qaeda senior leadership or ISIS senior leadership to make a hard decision between paying the family of a suicide fighter and bomber or investing in a more sophisticated WMD program, that's a win, right? If you force them to have to make that choice, if you constrain their budget. It's much more difficult now, though, you're right, in two ways. One, you have this fractured, metastasized movement, and so a lot of these individuals in Western Europe are relying on criminal activity and such, and so you rely on good police work to try to ferret it out and disrupt it. The other problem, we've seen this with ISIS, but also the insurgencies that ISIS is now a part of in these wilayats or provinces that have been declared, is that they run local economies. They actually run extortion rings. They run tax operations. They, in some cases, like Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, they have very sophisticated trade-based money laundering with the export of charcoal and the import of sugar. The North African affiliate of Al-Qaeda has made an industry of kidnap for ransom to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. So it's very hard to use tools that go after, to your point, state actors or well-organized hierarchical organizations when it's much more localized or diffused. And that's why in the case of Iraq and Syria and ISIS, so much of the campaign on disrupting terrorist financing has been disrupting their hold on territory and resources. That's why you've seen now, interestingly, Treasury officials sitting down with military planners and strategists to actually pick out which mobile refineries to hit and actually hitting cash centers. So if you've seen some of these videos, we've actually bombed the cash centers that ISIS has used with cash flowing up into the air. That's because you've literally have Treasury officials sitting next to Department of Defense targeteers to go after the physical infrastructure of groups that have learned to use the land and the local economy to their benefit. And so we've got to be more creative. We've got to figure out how do you disrupt those links and where are those vulnerabilities for these groups, understanding you're not going to stop each and every attack.
Very interesting. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Congresswoman, perhaps I think the mic will be coming. Where's the mic? Mic runner? Because I know they tape these things, so they like to get your question on tape. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you, Wendy, and this brilliant panel. You really were extraordinary. But I am puzzled, especially Ambassador Ford. I remember 2013, when many of us were really distraught. It's fine to analyze Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but in the meantime, thousands of people were dying in Syria. And I can remember many briefings, classified and others, at the State Department. To sum it all up, and none of you mentioned, Ambassador Ford for a minute, mentioned Russia, but you didn't give it much significance at all. And it was my understanding in 2013, after the president didn't let go and drew the red line and didn't act on it, that it was, at least from my briefings and Kerry's talk with Lavrov, this was all about Russia and making a deal with Russia, and that was all about Ukraine. So maybe it's irrelevant to this extraordinary discussion, but I get a lot of briefings and I never heard any of this invaluable information. So to this day, having just come back from a Russian 5 days, to this day, what is Russia's role? Was Kerry wrong in spending so much time with Lavrov? Was it the Russians that had a key role, or all of the other issues which you've discussed so brilliantly and eloquently?
Robert, who wants to?
Two key points. Russia does not want a political solution in Syria that changes the Syrian government deeply. Say that again. Russia does not want a political deal in Syria that effects deep change in the Syrian government. Change maybe one guy over here and one guy over there, and it would be very cosmetic. Wouldn't be the kind of deep change that the Americans wanted. Second point, their ability to get even that kind of a concession from the Syrian government, the Russians' ability to get even small concessions from the Syrian government, is compromised by the very strong Iranian support that Bashar al-Assad enjoys. And so I once had a conversation with a very senior Russian official in 2013, and I said to him, we are hoping that you're going to really lean on him. And the Russian official said to me, what, do you think we can just go into Bashar al-Assad's office and tell him to pack up? He said, it doesn't work that way. My own experience in Iraq, when we had 150,000 soldiers in Iraq, we couldn't march into the Iraqi government and give them instructions, even in 2005 and 2006, when they were very dependent on us. Sometimes the local people have more agency, have more power and ability to make their own decisions than you would expect. And so to think that the Russians were going to fix the Syrian problem for us, I think was more of a hope than a deep analysis.
We're really running out of time, and there's so many hands. Let's take 4 questions, and then the whole panel can address whatever you want, and we'll go on to the next thing. We have a person here. There's a hand in the back. Let's take this young woman here, and that young fellow with the blue shirt in the back.
Brian Rigg from Dallas, also a retired Marine. You know,
Semper Fi.
Semper Fi. You're right. So in World War II, Nazi Germany had 18 million men under arms. Tojo Japan had over 10 million. They were nations of ISIS fighters, if you will. Why can't we, knowing that where they are regionally, take out 40 to 60,000 fighters? Why are we not doing that?
Okay, question in the back.
Hi, I'm Andrew Gross from the Israeli Consulate in New York. My question is, this morning there's an article, several articles about the Gulf states cutting off relations with Qatar. There's food trucks waiting in line to go into Qatar that are being blocked. What is your opinion of this, and particularly your opinion about the Gulf states punishing Qatar because of its relations and support of Iran?
Okay, final question. The young man in the blue shirt. Oh, no, wait a minute.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a student at the University of Toronto, and this is a question for Ambassador Ford. I was wondering if you could describe, from a personal perspective, what it was like being in Syria as the geopolitical situation became more and more tense, what it was like being there, and if you could have imagined that the situation then would look like what it does now.
And then the final question in the blue shirt. And just a note to panelists, we've got 10 minutes.
My name is William. I'm from New Jersey. I just graduated from Baltimore College. I actually had a similar question to the second question about the recent news out of Qatar and how that related to the shifting fault lines that have been discussed in regard to geopolitics in the region.
Okay, Robert, we'll go down the line.
I've talked a lot, so I'm going to do very briefly on Syria. It was very at the start we hoped that there wouldn't be violence, and the American message to both the Syrian government and the protest marchers was stay peaceful, do dialogue, don't shoot, don't bomb, talk to each other. That became impossible as the Syrian government became more and more repressive. By autumn of 2011, protests were still going on, but we were by then telling American citizens to get out of the country And the reason was, although we didn't say it publicly, we said there is a horrible civil war coming. And I had in my head something between what I saw in Algeria. You could just see what was coming. I will say I misjudged three things. I never expected Iran and Russia to send tens of thousands of their own soldiers to fight for Bashar al-Assad. I never expected that.
Who would?
Number two, I never thought Bashar al-Assad would use chemical weapons against his own people so visibly. I did not expect that. And number three, it was unimaginable to me that the West would allow al-Qaeda to fill a vacuum that was formed by 2012 in eastern Syria that could join up. I mean, we told them it was coming, and the administration didn't move. So
I changed my mind. I'm going to go next to Gilles, because I know you have to leave in a few minutes.
Thank you very much. So maybe a sort of comment on this Qatar-Saudi rift that we had today. It's not only about Iran directly. There's also, there's a thorn in the feet or wherever in the back of the Saudis, which is what is happening in Yemen now. Because there was so much Wahhabi or Salafi proselytism on the sort of mild Shias, if you want, or the Zaydis of Yemen, there was a strong anti-Saudi reaction in the north of Yemen, and Iranians saw there a window of opportunity, and they sort of boosted a movement amongst the local Shias, movement which is called the Houthi movement, which is very anti-Saudi, and which has started this border war, which is turning as a nightmare for Saudi Arabia, particularly for Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's Minister of Defense, son of the king, and one of the key architects of the sort of the McCants Saudi policy, if we like to call it, that President Trump praised during his trip there. So there is a very, very important issue of Saudi security, which is taking place in Yemen. The Qataris are accused by the Saudis and the other Gulf countries who back the Saudis on the Yemeni issue to be at least ambiguous on the support of the Houthi insurgency. So that's one thing. The other issue is one that has to do with gas, because Iran and Qatar share this huge gas fields in the Persian Gulf, which the Iranians call South Pars and the Qataris North Dome. And they cannot afford to be in a situation of conflictuality, particularly in a time when, and this is something we have not mentioned, that where the Middle East system functioned because everybody was paid by oil. There were remittances, and when you had the barrel was $100. Now, with something happening in Texas, which I hear is called fracking, which is not an obscene word because it takes place in Texas, the barrel is something like is going to be $40 more or less, and I'm being told that the pace of the progress in technology is such that it's going to go down. So let's say if we have a stabilized barrel at $30 or whatever, then there's going to be no Saudi Arabia, no Iran, nothing anymore. The whole country is going to be in enormous turmoil. And I guess that the Qataris are now holding their breath because they need to have a sort of working economic relation with Iran, which is also on dire straits because of that. So this is another very important issue which we had no time to discuss, but I believe it's also it underlines those religious and political issues. Is the Middle East going to be as central and as much of an irritant as it was in the past because of the oil? This is a big question mark for your next AJC forum next year.
Right. Juan, final.
just maybe I can do lightning round and hit several themes. On this, I think we shouldn't forget the animosity that Saudi Arabia and the UAE and others have for the Muslim Brotherhood as well.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Qatari support for those movements, which really was at a height during the Arab revolutions. Wendy, you know this better than anybody. We've gone through waves of this, and so there's been a lot of impatience with Qatari independence in terms of their relationship with Iran, but also the Muslim Brotherhood. And
Turkey.
Exactly. And so this is not new, but it's a more severe rupture, obviously. The reason I'm interested in this as well is to watch how this plays out in terms of the proxy wars. Because when you think about the terrorism and extremism problem, much of the accelerant at this point is the fact that we're talking about regional and geopolitical battles, proxy battles, whether it's in Yemen or Lebanon or Syria, Iraq, where al-Qaeda, ISIS actually play a part in those proxy battles against Hezbollah, against some of the Shia militias. And so how that evolves actually begins to shape the very nature of terrorism and the very nature of state sponsorship of terrorism. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Why we haven't lined up against al-Qaeda the way we did in World War II or against conventional militaries, precisely because they aren't conventional militaries, right? And I think part of this has been a little bit of lack of intelligence, some of it kind of, I think, hopeful or willful neglect in terms of assumptions as to where the threat was going. Ambassador Ford made reference to that in terms of what was coming in the Levant from al-Qaeda and ISIS. Part of it is that these are groups that are very good at hiding in plain sight and embedding in communities. They've been in Mosul, they've been in Raqqa. There have been sensitivities on our part in terms of human casualties and also destroying infrastructure that will be important for those cities and those countries post facto. And we've also wanted to let the local forces take ownership of these problems. And so you've had to build capacity and cooperate, et cetera. So it's not a neat analogy, and I think it's difficult to draw those parallels. But I take your frustration, and I too have been frustrated that we haven't been a bit more aggressive and muscular, and I think you're beginning to see that now. Final point on Russia, just very quickly. I think the Russians have been incredibly savvy at boxing the U.S. in terms of our policy options. And so with every visit, this is my outside criticism of what we try to do with the Russians. With every visit to Moscow, the Russians, I think, maneuvered in a way not only to advance their own interests, but to limit our own options. And so when the Russians went in and served as the lifeline after the red line was not enforced, they, in some ways, were given a bit more carte blanche to operate. And so our ability to think about no-fly zones suddenly constricted.
Yeah.
Our ability to think about how we maneuver with Iran and on the ground was limited. And so I think the Russians have been masterful at not only playing on our weaknesses, but taking the diplomatic openings to constrain U.S. options.
Will, you get to wrap up.
Okay, 2 quick points. One on the regional competition between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. We saw this play out in Syria early in the Civil War. They're notionally partnered with one another in the United States, but as Ambassador Ford alluded to, they could not get on the same page about who to fund. Neither could the United States, and this left a big opening for independent entrepreneurs, private citizens, wealthy citizens in the Gulf to flood the zone with money, and this accounts for the growth of a lot of the extremist groups in the Syrian conflict. As for the question about why can't we get this done in Syria and Iraq, completely agree with Juan, and I would also say it's a political question. No one is contemplating putting a large contingent of American troops on the ground. Something like that effort, not necessarily by us, but some large contingent of troops will have to be present in Syria and Iraq to stabilize those areas once the Islamic State goes down. Nobody is putting that on the table so far, and the Islamic State will come roaring back as a consequence if it's not done.
And I don't think it can be Kurds that are that for it.
Right.
Well, on that happy note, join me in thanking the panel.